Hello, I'm Hideo Tanaka, a certified focusing trainer at the International Focusing Institute. On this channel, I will introduce focusing and Gendlin's philosophy. Now, let's get right into the topic of this video. The title of my presentation is The Intricacy of Bodily Implying and the Life Forward Direction. Eugene Gendlin proposed the concept implying to explain living processes. Although we tend to think in terms of cause and effect, the process of implying differs from this kind of causal relationship. To illustrate what it means to think in terms of cause and effect, let's look at an example from his paperback Focusing. The reason I'm alone must be because I picked the wrong man. I must be attracted to a type that eventually rejects me. It must be because I'm looking for someone like my father. Whether or not the basic assumptions behind this person's analysis are broadly correct, the analysis doesn't do her much good. Nothing inside her has changed. She is still stuck. As a matter of fact, the very terms in which a self-analysis is conducted tend to emphasize that stuck quality. When you tell yourself, "That's the way I am," you imply that there is no possibility of change. In such a case, the typical chain of cause and effect that can be analyzed is the idea that it must be so. This way of thinking is based on the idea that past experiences cause necessary result in the present. It is like a law of classical physics. It's similar to pushing a domino, which causes the dominoes behind it to fall one after another. However, Gendlin asserts that if you pause and tap the felt sense through focusing, you will gain insights that differ from the chain of cause and effect. Let's quote from the paperback Focusing again. Focusing doesn't envision a human being as a fixed structure whose shape can be analyzed once and for all. It envisions a person as a process capable of continual change and forward movement. The process referred to here is neither logically necessary nor a chaotic free-for-all, but rather another way of moving forward. Gendlin considers that living processes, including not only humans, but also plants and animals, generally progress as described above. He discusses these living processes which differ from cause and effect in the logical sense, as the body implies the next step. Let's first look at what implying has in common with other animals. Then we will see how it becomes more intricate and elaborate when we act, speak, and think at the human level. First, I will quote from the writing of George Herbert Mead, who was in the American School of Philosophy known as pragmatism in the first half of the 20th century. In the ox, there is hunger and also the sight and odor, which bring in the food. The whole process is not found simply in the stomach, but in all the activity of grazing, choosing the cud, and so on. This process is one which is intimately related to the so-called food which exists out there. In this way, hunger is related to eating. By asserting that this relation is very specific and different from others, Gendlin continues Mead's argument. Let's quote from his 1973 paper, Experiential Psychotherapy. For example, between hunger and eating, there is a change, but this isn't just any kind of change, as from hunger to being poisoned or being temporarily shifted to pain, flight, anxiety, or sexual intercourse. Eating thus has a very specific relation to being hungry, although it is certainly a change. And he proposes to call this kind of continuity hunger implies eating. Let's quote the following passage from Experiential Psychotherapy again. Any moment of bodily living thus implies or tends toward further living, but not just anything one pleases, only just certain different looking steps. There is a bodily felt continuity in these steps. It doesn't require a biologist to sense that eating is what follows hunger. On the contrary, the term implying is not used outside of living processes. For example, an inorganic substance like iron combines with oxygen to form iron oxide. However, Gendlin would never describe this physical causation as iron implies oxygen. Let's get back to the living process. When hunger was satisfied by actually eating and it was no longer implied, he says, the hunger was carried forward by eating. Now, I said that the living process in which hunger implies eating is a very specific relation that is different from being poisoned or sexual intercourse, but is a relation that this implying is carried forward by still similar to the only one necessary relationship, like the physical law of falling dominoes. Gendlin argues that this is not the case as follows. Hunger could also be carried forward by something new. It is now time to look at his main philosophical book, A Process Model. Intravenous feeding also carries a process forward. A wonderful variety of modes of feeding is found in nature. The implying implies some way of carrying forward, not any one way. Implying is always open, and what occurs into it does not equal it. Since there is always implying, all occurring happens into implying, but not always as the implying implies. Gendlin briefly summarizes the nature of living processes as follows. A process differs both from arbitrariness and from logic. By it differs from arbitrariness, he means that it is not anything goes. In the previous example, it corresponds to the fact that hunger does not imply being poisoned or sexual intercourse. By it differs from logic, he means that, unlike Euclidean geometry, it is not the only possible way of proceeding. In the previous example, it corresponds to the fact that hunger can also be carried forward by intravenous feeding. Moreover, at the human level, the ways in which hunger is carried forward are even more intricate and elaborate. Let me quote again from his paper, Experiential Psychotherapy. Humans are carried forward when hungry, not only by food, but also by washing their hands and sitting at the table, and also by speaking about hunger and food, although eventually a meal must come too. Not only objects like food, but also other people's interpersonal respondings, and also words can carry the interactive body process forward. However, if a person relies solely on emotions before forming a felt sense, they may become somewhat governed by the patterned one. Let's look at this from the paperback Focusing. Throughout history, people expressed themselves in routine patterns of language and understood themselves that way too. Types of emotional experiences were labeled. If someone cheated you, you were angry. If someone gave you something, grateful. We usually tend to react to situations in ways patterned by our emotions, such as anger or gratitude. At such times, the process of focusing involves pausing and re-feeling the more complicated felt sense that lies beneath the emotions. As you tap the felt sense that changes with each situation, it implies the next step. However, the implying here is more intricate and increasingly diverges from the physical law of dominoes falling. Gendlin calls this implying at the felt sense level the life forward direction. Let's look at chapter 19 of Focusing Oriented Psychotherapy, which is named after this concept. After a few steps, a life forward direction might require something that looks like the opposite of what transpired in the earlier steps. For example, for one client, it is a great step for her to fight and not retreat and hide. To overcome her earlier pattern of hiding, she fights openly, visibly, flamboyantly. But later on, it turns out that she fights more effectively by no longer doing it so visibly. Therefore, it is a step for her to fight more covertly. Someone might think this is the opposite, that now she is hiding again. But this hiding is not the same pattern of retreating and hiding from before. The definition of what leads in the same direction may change many times. From the verbal content alone, we cannot decide what is the life-forward direction for a given person. Thus, even though the directions may appear to be opposed by definition at the felt sense level, they are not anything but a certain peculiar continuity. This kind of continuity is described by Gendlin in his 1991 philosophical paper, Thinking Beyond Patterns, as, despite the seeming denial of what each previous step said, the steps move in one direction. And let's see what he has to say about this kind of intricate direction in his 1992 philosophical paper, The Wider Role of Bodily Sense in Thought and Language. The intricacy of bodily implying has an other than formed direction. It may seem that every step of such a process changes its direction. As we pursue a goal, the goal seems to change. But later, we say our new goal is the one we really wanted all along, but we didn't know it. Through the specific example of hiding, fighting openly, and fighting covertly, it is easy to understand that Gendlin uses the term direction in two different senses in philosophical writings. First, let us quote again from his paper Thinking Beyond Patterns. The word direction worked newly long ago to say a logical direction, and now it moves again in to say the direction of how this more than logical progression follows. Organized in this way, it will be easy to understand the two different uses of direction in his main philosophical book, A Process Model. Let's quote from the final chapter 8. I want this direction, but not as definable in 7, but rather as about to be changed in an 8 carrying forward. So far as 7 can possibly define it, it is this direction into which I mean to head. But in addition, an 8 use of that word would intend the direction not yet definable. Conclusion. Gendlin asserts that a process differs both from arbitrariness and from logic, holds true not only at the animal level, but also at the human level, and at the level where felt sense is formed. Living processes proceed in ways that cannot be predicted in advance. However, when we look back, we realize that there was some kind of connection that existed from the beginning. Let me quote this from his practical main book, Focusing-Oriented Psychotherapy. In retrospect, once a step has occurred, it is possible to interpolate logical steps retroactively to relate to how the problem appeared before the step was taken. After the change, one can understand the progression, but in advance, one cannot prefigure it. Logic that can be traced back to the past is not predictable in advance. It is ex post facto logic. This is different from the causal prediction of, I was rejected by my father in the past, therefore I will be attracted to a type who rejects me. Gendlin may have described this different kind of temporal relationship as the life-forward direction, such as hiding, fighting openly, and fighting covertly. A more intricate and elaborate version of the term implying. That concludes this video. Please subscribe to my channel and give me a thumbs up.